Welcome to On the Middle East, the podcast of the award-winning media service El Monitor, where each week we talk with the decision makers and thought leaders who are making the news and shaping the trends in the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasolidi, president of El Monitor, and today we'll be talking about Russia, its role in Syria, its relationship with Iran, and how Russian President Vladimir Putin may be thinking about the outcome of the U.S. presidential election in November. Our guest will be Max Suchkov. He's a senior fellow at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. He's an expert at the Russian International Affairs Council, a non-resident scholar at the Washington-based Middle East Institute, and he's the former Russia Mideast coverage editor with El Monitor. My conversation about Russia with Max Suchkov after this short break.
Russia's own kind of leverage with Iran, again, as seen in Moscow, is gradually increasing because of the sanctions and because of this arms embargo that was discussed in the UN Security Council. And as you know, Russia stood strongly for this embargo to go away because it thinks it can occupy the biggest, or I wouldn't say this, it will be the single arms supplier. It will most likely compete with the Chinese there. But Russia thinks it can occupy a very important niche in the Iranian arms market once the embargo is lifted. There is still, I would say, cautious optimism if that may be possible if Trump is reelected, and I would say very blunt skepticism on the prospects of such cooperation if Biden is elected. There is a view that if Biden is elected, the Biden administration may be more hawkish, may be more responsive to the provocations and other things happening in Syria, may be more willing to invoke military option, and maybe more rigid in its standing that Assad should go and things like this.
That's Max Suchkov of the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, who is our guest today on the Middle East. Now, our conversation today with Max comes as Russian Federation Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov were in Damascus this week, where they met with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and others. For Russia, Syria is a success and linked to its global and regional ambitions. Assad is still in power and unlikely to be leaving soon. U.S. sanctions on Syria are in place and are going to stay there as long as there is no political transition and Assad is in power or radically changes his ways, which is unlikely. And those U.S. sanctions will limit any Russian-backed reconstruction or economic project. It will keep them very much small-scale endeavors. Now, Moscow is also weighing in Syria whether to back the Syrian government in perhaps another final assault to retake Idlib province in northwest Syria. That province is held mostly by the terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, or Liberation of the Levant in English, and other armed groups opposed to the Syrian government. The trick in Idlib is that such an assault risks escalation with Turkey, another Russian ally, which has military forces in the region and which has clashed with Syrian forces. Now, despite differences, the Russian, Turkish, Iranian diplomatic grouping in Syria, they call it the Astana Group, remains committed to backing Assad and opposing the United States. East of the Euphrates, U.S. and Russian forces have clashed in a crowded space in that part of Syria, which also includes a Turkish occupation zone, areas controlled by the primarily Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which was the U.S. partner on the ground in Syria in defeating ISIS. And there are also Iranian and Iranian-backed forces there, as well as Syrian government troops. Risks of escalation there remain high. Now, to sort out Russia's Syria strategy and what it means for U.S. Russian relations, we will now turn to my conversation with Max Suchkov, who is joining us from Moscow. Max, welcome to On the Middle East.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back with All Monitor.
It's good to be talking with you. Let's start with Syria. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov was there this week. He met with President Assad and others. Among the topics were economic agreements, but it seems, given the U.S. stance, there'll be no reconstruction as long as Assad is in power and the political process is stalled. In addition to U.S. sanctions and what the Trump administration has called the summer of Caesar. How do you see Lavrov's visit and how this is all playing out in terms of Russian interests in Syria?
Well, yes, indeed. The Lavrov visit, even though Lavrov was not formally the head of the delegation was led by the Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov, who is in charge of this kind of Russian-Syrian economic dimension, which is an important indicator of what the delegation was seeking in Damascus. Lavrov's own visit was the first in 8 years, and I think it was symbolic in a way that a lot of people have been asking the same question all over again. Now that Russia, quote unquote, won war, can it win peace? And I think that was supposed to mark an important milestone and kind of a next stage of Russia's presence in Syria that would refocus from the military engagement to economic engagement. As to the question of how that may come about, how that may happen, Moscow is coming out of the picture that is now Syria is kind of in, which is Syria was hit by four major factors in the last year: the impacts of the coronavirus, the neighboring crisis in Lebanon, which put additional burden on Syrian economy, the conflict within elites, the continued defragmentation, and the U.S. Caesar sanctions came on top of it as an additional kind of deteriorator, and kind of complicated the picture. So when decision makers in Moscow, sit around the table and think what should the next steps be, they basically, I would say, even in some time in December, the idea was that there is either kind of an extensive quote unquote strategy, broader strategy that would imply involvement of large state companies and under top-down directives from the Kremlin to push through the sanctions and do some reconstruction and investments, or the kind of a more narrow approach where small companies run primarily by oligarchs or say cronies around Putin's circle would be doing the same work, because most of them are under sanctions anyway, and they kind of less risk averse than the big state corporations. So it looks, including from the Lavrov visit, that this is kind of the path that Moscow chose to go. And the agreement that most of the discussion was evolving in Damascus is the one signed in 2018 between Russia and Syria, and Lavrov and Borisov recommitted Russian stance in restoring about 40 infrastructure facilities in Syria. Most of them have to do with the hydroelectric stations that back in the day the Soviet engineers help design and construct. So that'll be most of the effort would be directed to that. And of course, the other things, it would include Russian investments. So I would say, even though they're minimal, or say not at the level that they would have been otherwise, if the Europeans and Americans were on board, the idea was to kind of what the Syrian Foreign Minister Mualim said, the idea is to break through the quote-unquote sanctions blockade. And that is kind of one big picture thing. And the second one is, of course, the political design. Lavrov's visit came days after he met with Geir Peterson in Moscow. And, this idea of that the Constitutional Committee doesn't really go anywhere. There is little progress. And I think there are two things very important mentioned during the visit. One, that the presidential election in Syria that are scheduled for next year should not be linked with with any progress in the Constitutional Committee. And the second one, that there are no specific timeline, points, or there's no specific timeline for concrete questions to be achieved within this Constitution Committee. This is kind of the position of the Syrian government that Russia supported, which pretty much give you a sense that there's unlikely to be a major political change. And that means, the Europeans and Americans are very unlikely to be doing anything in terms of reconstruction or investments, whereas the Chinese and the Gulf monarchies are likely to be more cautious about how they approach the investments because of the sanctions.
Max, some U.S. officials have begun to talk about divergences in the Russian and Iranian positions in Syria, that perhaps these differences can somehow lead to a convergence of U.S. and Russian interests in seeing Iran withdraw Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups from the country. Is this a realistic possibility for U.S. policy, and how deep are these Russian-Iranian differences in Syria?
Well, as you know, Russia and Iran do not ever discuss their disagreements on Syria in public, and even in Damascus, there was not a single statement that would, suggest that Russia is in conflict with Iran in Syria. But as you mentioned, there's kind of this disagreements and different interests pursued. I think Russia for now thinks it's in a better position in terms of what it can offer economic wise to Iran. Also, the conflict of elites that I just mentioned before makes it theoretically, again, as far as Moscow is concerned, Assad wanting to clinch more to Russia than to Iran is kind of, his options are limited. And there is a military option and economic option that Russia can deliver where Iran cannot. And he's kind of traditional balancing, between, or, kind of wagging the tail of both Moscow and Tehran or beating each other against one another. So that game will definitely or most likely continue, but Russia thinks that Assad's maneuvering on this is rather limited for now, that at least with what can do. But Russia's own kind of leverage with Iran, again, as seen in Moscow, is gradually increasing because of the sanctions and because of this arms embargo that was discussed in the UN Security Council. And as you know, Russia stood strongly for this embargo to go away because it thinks it can occupy the biggest, or I wouldn't say this, it will be the single arms supplier. It will most likely compete with the Chinese there, but Russia thinks it can occupy a very important niche in the Iranian arms market once the embargo is lifted. And that is kind of one incentive, again, as seen from Moscow, for Iran to be more cooperative with Russia, including on Syria.
Some say that the difference conceptually is that Syria, I should say Russia, supports the Syrian state and its institutions more directly. Iran, as it does in Iraq, as it does in Lebanon, also supports sub-state actors such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Popular Mobilization Fronts in Iraq. Is that part of the difference, or what exactly are they in dispute about? Because they both support Assad, and I would assume both see this as a successful effort in keeping him in power and thwarting U.S. interests in the area.
Right. Well, I don't disagree with that assumption. I think Russia's interest is kind of broader and linked to its kind of global role, whereas Iranian, interest in Syria is primarily vetted in its kind of regional ambitions. So for Russia to be a quote unquote a constructive global power, it does need to be bringing different parties on board. It does need to be showing, creative diplomacy. It does need to be showing things like, that it can manage its proxies or allies effectively. And I definitely don't know whether it was communicated to Assad in Damascus during the Lavrov-Borisov visit, but I would say there is kind of a growing consensus in Moscow that if Assad does not embrace reforms, he will end up pretty much with a little money and only with part of Syria, and he won't be able to get the entire control of all of the country that as he wishes. But in order to do that, there's also, I think, a feeling in Russia that the key thing that needs to be reformed for any other reforms to continue successfully is the reform of the security apparatus, where Iran definitely has a strong voice and presence and influence, and where this is where I think kind of the biggest differences are, because the security apparatus and how it is reformed and what it's going to look like in the quote unquote new Syria is going to probably not define the Iranian presence in the country, but have a lot of impact on the Iranian presence in the country and Russia's interest as well. I would also mention that, because of the Turkish presence in Syria and growing presence, there is a feeling in Russia that ultimately the things that Russia needed to achieve in Syria in terms of its interest and presence in economic and security and the presence in the Eastern Mediterranean have been primarily achieved. And all these kind of territorial disputes and other things that, and the part of Syria that Turkey continues to kind of occupy, this is a bigger problem for Iran rather than for Russia. So you would see, and Iran has been keeping a rather kind of low profile on these issues up until now. So I think in Russia's view, this is kind of a big picture thing that will most likely play out between Iran and Turkey in some time in the future.
What about Assad in this configuration? When I talk to Russian officials and interview them and Russian analysts, I always get the impression that Assad is seen as a difficult partner and ally, whereas when you talk to other analysts in the region and elsewhere, some say that Assad will basically do what Russia says. How do you see that relationship with Assad in particular?
Well, I don't think these two narratives are mutually exclusive, to be honest, because I think there are no easy counter partners in that part of the world anyway. And Assad, of course, has been a very, I want to find a right word, maybe sly or new, how to play external actors, including against one another, to stay in power. And I think him being there and doing what he's doing are kind of a marker of his abilities to do that. I think there is little illusion in Moscow about Assad's kind of commitment in terms of, there was one question that once I think a French journalist asked Putin something about Assad, and Putin kind of smirked and said, well, don't ask me this question about Assad's relationship with the West, because he was a more frequent guest in Western capitals than in Russia before the Syrian crisis happened. So I think it's kind of, it gives you a clue that, Russia's view on Assad is that he aligned with Russia because he had no other option, and this is kind of, we're talking about marriage of convenience, a popular metaphor to describe either Russia's relations with Syria, with Iran, or with Turkey. I would say that marriage, as in case with Turkey, actually also hinges on the kids, and by the kids, I mean the kind of the joint projects that Russia and Syria and Turkey, in that sense, also invested in, and in case of Russia in Syria, That is, of course, the commitment, the public image, something that Putin personally very much appreciates. No matter how the bad guy is, if he promised him something, if he claimed to be his ally, he will continue to be invested in that person and stay with that person regardless of the potential reputational losses. That happens in Russian domestic politics, that happens in Russian foreign policy as well. So I think while Assad is an uneasy partner, as long as he goes along the way with the Russian agenda, and Moscow adopts his own agenda, something that I mentioned before, in terms of political reform and the constitutional committee, they should be fine with each other. Even though I don't exclude that it's at some point in the future, after perhaps presidential election in the United States, if, for instance, there is a second Trump term, there might be, and Moscow hopes for another quote unquote deal with the United States and Syria, there might be a situation where Russia, asks kind of a soft-faced transition, asks Assad to accept a soft-faced transition to someone else, some kind of a successor that, Syrian elite can agree to, the different factions in Syria can accept, and maybe that can be more or less acceptable to the outside world. And that perhaps will signal kind of a new stage in the Syrian crisis and the Syrian settlement.
Max, we've written in our monitor about the two fronts in Syria. There's Idlib in the northwest and the areas east of the Euphrates, some of which are under control of the primarily Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces. Let's start with Idlib for a minute, which the province is mostly controlled these days by the terrorist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Liberation of the Levant, or HTS, and which earlier this year saw fighting between Turkish and Syrian forces. Now, Turkey is an ally of Russia in the Astana group. There are Russian-Turkish joint patrols along a strategic highway there. And Russia is also backing the Syrian assault on Idlib and expects Turkey to deal with HTS. Very complicated situation, not to mention the humanitarian aspects of this, where since the offensive began last year, close to 1 million people have been displaced, many killed. How does Russia see the situation in Idlib being resolved, given the complexity and tension between Syria and Turkey?
With all these developments that you've mentioned, I still get a feeling that there has been little progress on Idlib ever since the first kind of Russian-Turkish memorandum on Idlib was signed 2 years ago. In the sense that it is still an area largely outside the Syrian government control. It's still the area that is largely run by the HTS, except for perhaps there are a lot more pro-Turkey factions in the area now, and that Turkey has strengthened its positions in the area. And that, I think, you said Turkey is an ally of Russia. I think there is kind of linguistic nuance very important, but it's also important for political reasons. Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, once described Turkey as an ally, but not necessarily a partner of the United States. And I think in case of Russia, it's just the opposite. It's definitely a partner, but not an ally. And that kind of interesting but important distinction, in the sense that Russia does not expect Turkey to behave in an allied manner, and still there is a lot of kind of distrust in the relationship, of course, but at the same time it thinks that the relationship with Turkey is important and goes way beyond Syria, of course. As I mentioned before, there are tons of things like Turkish Stream, the Akkuyu power plant, the Russian participation in the Turkish military modernization, and which S-400 missile system is a part of. So I think strategically, Turkey sees Russia as a kind of multiplier of its own ambitions as a regional power, and Russia needs Turkey as a multiplier of its own, or enabler of Russia's role as a global power. So that relationship, and of course, there's a very strong personal relationship with Putin and Erdogan, strong in the sense that the two men pretty much speak the same language of power and pragmatism, bordered in cynicism. But they kind of speak in this in or see the world through the same lens. There are different views inside Russia on what should be done next. There's some factions that are calling upon decision makers to support the Syrian drive to kind of quote unquote settle the issue militarily, meaning to support a military offensive and crush HTS and whatever loyal Turkish group there. There are others who are saying the military option will trigger a military clash between Russia and Turkey that is not in Moscow or Ankara's interests, and the Moscow just should come to terms that Ankara is there to stay, and it's better to kind of outsource all those groups to Ankara's control, but meaning that Turkey is going to be in control of that part of Syria for years to come, because Turkey is taking a much deeper presence there through schools, for monetary system and other means. And there is little that Russia can do other than exacerbate its relations with Turkey. So if it's not willing to do that, it'll have to accept it as a reality, even though there is all this talk about Syrian territorial integrity and things like this that nominally Russia and Turkey support. So yeah, I think Idlib is still big unknown. For now, however, I would say a lot of attention, especially in the recent few weeks, have been directed to Russia's efforts to do something in the east. And by doing something, I mean there are still two tracks that we've written about back in the day, that Russia supports. On the one hand, this kind of the track between the Kurds, different Kurdish tribes and groups, and Damascus, with the same message, trying to convince the Kurds to align with Syrian officials and instill the thinking that Americans are not reliable partners anyway. And there is the track that is now you don't really hear much about, but it still hasn't gone away from being considered, which is Russia mediating between Turkey and Syria. But again, like I said, it's still kind of Putin hibernation mode for now. But there is this big issue, of course, with the American presence, that Russians still trying to figure out what to do. The United States cannot be driven out militarily. It cannot be driven out militarily with mercenaries, because we remember what happened in February, 2017 or 2018, when the US killed a bunch of Russian mercenaries with Air Force. So there are all these kind of provocations once in a while, even though this deconfliction channel is still operating. There are these provocations that are meant to make the life of American troops a little more difficult than it is now, and because thinking that there is no kind of strategic plan for U.S. presence other than take control of oil reserves and strip Assad of revenue and make the burden on Russian supporting the Syrian regime even harder.
Max, let me ask you a big picture question about Syria with regard to how it plays into the U.S.-Russian relationship. Does Putin see Syria as a means to thwart U.S. goals and interests in the Middle East, or does he see it as perhaps at some point an opportunity to engage the United States, as Russia had suggested at the beginning of the Trump administration term, in counterterrorism, for example, and to try to get sanctions lifted? Do you see, or is it a little of both?
Well, I think initially, or the primary impulse for Putin was to have Syria as a place for a discussion, with a dialogue, with a kind of great big power game, or big power deal with the United States. Putin was the first, when he came to power in early 2000s, he was the first to call George W. Bush to express condolences on the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And also, he thought that the counterterrorism was pretty much, a very important agenda for two countries. And as the U.S. and Russian relations, kept sliding into new lows, counterterrorism has remained one of the few options, or if not the only option, together with the arms control that Moscow still thought there can be progress in. And when Trump was elected, the three intelligence chiefs went to Washington with the same agenda again. And even when Russia took the decision to intervene in Syria in the fall of 2015, Putin's speech at the UN General Assembly was themed with the idea of, appealing to the Americans. Let's have this kind of grand anti-ISIS coalition that will resemble anti-Hitler coalition of World War II, and fight this common enemy together. But then, since nothing worked out of that, he thought that Russia then should be refocusing on partnering with regional heavyweights, Turkey, Iran, and others, and playing its own game, and kind of including part of that game was the game of denial. Even though, regardless of whether Americans pursued any specific interest in Syria or were there just to not let Russia do something, as many in Moscow think. The idea was, we will play this kind of the game of denial and not allow Americans to do whatever they want to do. Now, I think, and then again, when Trump came to power, there was this big hope that something can work out of that. But then, because of the collusion and interference and other things, and it never worked out. And now there's kind of debates in Moscow on whether there might be a new chance for this kind of cooperation, or a quote unquote big deal in Syria, because it will ultimately also please Russia's kind of deep interest in positioning itself as a superpower on the world stage, having this big debate with the United States as a sole superpower. And, there is still, I would say, cautious optimism if that may be possible if Trump is reelected, and I would say very blunt skepticism on the prospects of such cooperation if Biden is elected. There is a view that if Biden is elected, the Biden administration may be more hawkish, maybe more responsive to the provocations and other things happening in Syria, may be more willing to invoke military option, and maybe more rigid in its standing that Assad should go, and things like this.
As we approach the U.S. presidential election in less than 2 months here in the United States, there's increasing concern about the Russian information or disinformation campaign. What are the Russian objectives during the U.S. presidential election in terms of its information warfare?
Oh, it's hard to tell. I would say, well, again, there are different streams of thought, right? Those who think, or those who perceive the United States as an adversary, they still think on whether kind of inflaming or fueling the current hostilities that are in the streets of America, or kind of driving more wedges in this kind of cleavages that there are in American society may be a good strategy, to make the life harder for the United States, to make the United States focus on its own domestic problems, and that'll make the U.S. less willing to engage abroad. There are others who say, well, maybe the idea should be that we should be supporting Trump, and then his policies will make America focus on its own efforts, and he's more anti-war, so he's now willing to engage in kind of foreign interventions, and that may be good for Russia. But there are others who are saying, well, maybe, it should be the other way around. Maybe we should be thinking more about, engaging with the Democrats and supporting the Democrats, hoping that, if Biden is elected, there are more kind of interventions in return to kind of mid 2000, late 1919 American style diplomacy that will diminish America's image in the world furthermore. So these kinds of things, but they're different groups, and as an outsider, you may think that the Kremlin or say Russia is, or whatever happens in Russia, whatever the discussion in Russia is just Kremlin centered, and it's not. There are more factions definitely involved in the foreign policy debate. Well, of course, in the system like Russia, Kremlin is the one making the final shots. But there even in the Kremlin, the people who thought that engagement with Trump may be a good idea now say it's just the choice between the two evils, perhaps, in the sense that the Trump administration imposed more sanctions than the Obama administration. So Trump didn't come out to be the best option for Russia, as opposed to perhaps kind of a general American narrative.
Whatever the strategy is in terms of the information warfare campaign, does President Putin and others in the Kremlin take satisfaction in sowing dissent in American politics? Is that not an objective in and of itself?
Well, perhaps it may be an objective in and of itself. Again, if it's hard to say what Putin has come to think of the United States. It's hard to say whether ever since 2016 when Trump was elected, Russia still expects quote unquote a grand bargain with the United States as an option, or Moscow just gave up on it, kind of altogether, and thinking that we should be focusing on cooperating with the Chinese, and then just our business with America, which should only be fueling the flames of domestic protests and things like this. I would think that the general expectation, that's actually what I was going to say in my previous remark, the general sense is that there's unlikely going to be a major change in U.S.-Russia relations, at least for the better, regardless of who occupies the White House. Because if it's the Democrats, the idea of this intervention in election interference and disinformation campaigns will still be an important agenda for them. So it'll be hard to do any diplomatic engagement or other talks, perhaps other than nuclear arms control. And there's a general sense that the Russian-American bilateral agenda has exhausted so much that there really isn't anything to talk about other than, to defend against each other's political or cyber attacks and things like this, which is very unfortunate, I think, and very dangerous for the two big nuclear powers, definitely.
Max, thank you for a rich discussion of Russian foreign policy in Syria and the Middle East and U.S.-Russian relations. It was a pleasure to have you today on the Middle East.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be with you guys.
We will be right back after this short break.
I'm Ben Caspit, Al Monitor veteran columnist reporting from Israel, one of the world's major news and action suppliers of all times, comparing to its tiny size. I've been covering and analyzing the political, diplomatic, and military arenas in Israel for over 34 years. My best-selling biography, The Netanyahu Years, was out 2 years ago. I covered 7 prime ministers, 1 major war, 2 intifadas, 1 prime minister's assassination, 2.5 peace treaties, 4 military operations in Gaza, and it's not letting up anytime soon. I'm glad to invite you to On Israel, our brand new podcast, where we will discuss major events in Israel and its surroundings, Talk to decision makers, leaders, and analysts and try to understand the chaos that comes with the territory of Israel and the Middle East. You will never have a dull moment with us. See you soon here on Israel Al Monitor.
Welcome back to On the Middle East. Many takeaways from our conversation with Max Suchkov. But let me just focus on one. That is the concern about Russia's information warfare during the U.S. presidential election season. First, the threat of cyber and information warfare is growing exponentially. There are no rules and endless possibilities for havoc and disruption. The prospect of what are known as deep fakes and other false stories can be impactful, especially because of social media, because news events or videos can go viral before the sources are verified or discounted. Second, we also don't want to hype the threat either. Putin's penny stock investments in Facebook ads and Twitter bots and posts should not come close to bringing Americans to panic, nor, it seems, should his media interventions at the margins of social media play a role in persuading someone to vote for either Joe Biden or Donald Trump, who are both well-known commodities in U.S. politics and offering the United States very different policies and directions. Perhaps instead of alarm, messages of reassurance that Americans in their electoral systems are up to the test of this presidential election. And that reassurance would be combined with the necessary vigilance to be sure that Putin and others who may seek to disrupt our election process are prevented from doing so. Third, while the U.S. will need to continue to maintain and expand its edge in information cyber warfare technologies, there will come a point, hopefully in the next administration, whoever wins, where there will be negotiations about the rules of the game in cyber, as there was with nuclear weapons and as there has been with ballistic missiles. This is overdue. Otherwise, this threat, both perceived and real, and the real threats are getting even more dangerous, all of this can blow up faith in one of the most fundamental of America's institutions, its electoral system and elections. And that's a victory we don't want to hand Putin or anyone else. Thank you all for listening to On the Middle East. I'm Andrew Parasiliti. We'll be back next week. And in the meantime, please sign up for this and our other Al Monitor podcast on Israel with Ben Caspit at your favorite podcast platform.